Hello and welcome to this Global Horizons podcast. This is the Delhi Policy Group and I'm Hemant Singh. At a time of disruptive change in the global order, DPG Podcasts will bring to you realist and relevant policy perspectives on key issues. We hope that you will enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to this podcast. Today's subject is Indonesia and India's relations with this most important Southeast Asian neighbor. I have with me here Dr. Satish Mishra, and let me begin by introducing Dr. Mishra to our listeners. Dr. Mishra is a well-known and widely published economist and strategic thinker. Over the past 4 decades, he has accumulated vast experience on economic development issues, working at the World Bank, the UNDP, the European Union, USAID, OECD, and finally heading the UN Support Facility for Indonesian Economic Recovery from 1999 to 2005. He has been based in Indonesia over the past 25 years, and his latest initiative is the Arthashastra Institute he has set up in Bali as a bridge for strategic, economic, and cultural exchange across South and Southeast Asia. Dr. Mishra, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
Why don't we begin by hearing from you what your expectations are from this new Arthashastra Institute which you have set up, and how will it take forward this idea of greater cooperation between South and Southeast Asia in general, and India and Indonesia in particular?
Well, the idea has been in the making for a while because for many years, most of my Indonesian friends and certainly the Indian friends were always saying that these two countries should be much closer together, and this is an old aspiration, but somehow there was not enough momentum in this direction. So we set up the Arthashastra Institute as a way to facilitate, connect, be a catalyst in a dialogue between India and Indonesia, but also much greater familiarity at the people level, at the institutional level, so that we're not always limiting awareness of India in Indonesia to Bollywood movies or to Bali temples on our side in India. And to correct this very poor state of knowledge, a lot of misapprehensions, a slow pace of initiatives, we thought that it's time now to set up the Arthashastra Institute.
Is it already up and running, and is it a continuation from your previous development of institutions which you have been involved with for the last 20 years?
Well, some of the ideas clearly have, and some of the methods of working have, but I think the idea is new because the circumstances have changed. I think the momentum is building and the time is right for an initiative like this. So it has been set up in the sense that we already have started working. We haven't launched it in some kind of big conference, which we hope to do will be in September, October this year. And but most of the pieces are in place, and we are hoping to roll out the programs after this meeting, where both prominent Indians and prominent Indonesians will be there in a much more focused way than was possible before.
Okay, that's good, excellent, good initiative, and congratulations. I hope you succeed in this venture. I think it would be very useful for our viewers to understand the Indonesian evolution in the last generation a little better. Indonesia became a democracy some 25 years ago. So let me start by seeking your insights on how matters have progressed since then. Are there still any recurring or lingering concerns about Indonesian democracy today? Should there be any?
Well, of course, there are many lingering concerns, partly because when the democratic movement started, it wasn't terribly focused. There were large numbers of fellow travelers who came in and joined it, and they had very different expectations. So those who had rather unrealistic and very lofty expectations of the new democracy sometimes feel a bit disappointed and jarred at particular changes that they see happening. But by and large, the public is very supportive. The elections are peaceful. People accept the results. The military is back in the barracks. The economy is doing very well. And it's a highly decentralized, fast-growing economy with young population. So if I take everything, it seems to me that, it's a pretty stable democracy. And it's quite remarkable because within 4 elections, I find I have not met a single Indonesian who says that, Indonesia might have coup d'etats like Thailand or end up like the Arab Spring countries in the Middle East. So that's quite an achievement.
Well, that's really an important development which has occurred in the last since the dawn of this century. I think people in India would also be very happy to hear from you, Dr. Mishra, about the very nature of this democratic evolution. Because if I can recall correctly, it has been marked by a systemic transition, going well beyond just the peaceful transfer of power. And it is, as you just mentioned, remarkably decentralized down to the grassroots. Officials down to the Bhupati level are elected officials. What, in your view, have been the main achievements of this process?
Well, there are many, but the first one is that if you start from the understanding of systemic transitions, there are very few of them, and for most people, it's once in a lifetime event. The Bolshevik Revolution set off a systemic transition. The fall of the Berlin Wall set off another systemic transition. The fall of the Shah of Iran and the arrival of the Ayatollah set off another systemic transition. And so did the fall of Suharto and the start of the new democracy. Because one of the things that happens in these is that at every single level, your governing institutions end up being reformed and changed and so on. So even to undertake that can be, a multi-generational task. And there are no real textbooks for it, because by definition, they happen so rarely that there's not enough accumulated experience. And one of the things that one has to be very careful of is not to use the past trends as a predictor of the future, because these are almost inflection points. And so most people don't really understand what that systemic transition means. But let me just give you an example. In the Indonesian context, it would have meant, or it has meant, the reform of the military, the reform of the parliamentary system, the reform of the president's office and the formation of the cabinet, the reform of the regional governments and their electoral systems, the establishment of new institutions like the Constitution Court, the State Audit Commission, and a whole series of checks and balances which are normal to a democracy. And doing it all without having the 3 years that we had to have a constituent assembly of hundreds of people, drafting a new constitution, etc., etc. This was all done under huge pressure and all done in a matter of 1 or 2 years. And 20 years later, if you take the list of all the reforms that were undertaken by the former USSR or Russia, following the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and put that against the reforms that Indonesia has taken, the Indonesia list is much, much longer. So that is what we're talking about. It's a complete remapping of every single aspect of normal life, and that's what's happened in Indonesia.
Is there any change at the moment? Because I noticed that there was some amount of unease in certain quarters in Jakarta about regulatory changes which allow the TNI to have a role in public positions. I don't think that it really is something very drastic, but still, why were these protests? What were they protesting about?
Well, I suppose the main protest was because they, under Suharto and what was called the New Order government before democracy started in the year 2000, the military had what was called a double function or dui fungsi, where they were seen as responsible for national defense and security, but they also were seen to be a group who had been involved in the independence movement and therefore should be allowed to contribute to economic development and to social development and so on and so on. And the feeling is that any hint of the military being allowed to do standard non-military functions was a way back to the former dictatorship of Suharto. I can understand the apprehension. Some of it is led by former generals who were reformist generals. But you have to see it in a wider context. And if you see it in the wider context, you see two things. One is that there is not a single political party in the country which is actually arguing for a higher role of the military. So in the political world, there's no echo there. The second thing is under Suharto, the military was only provided 25% of the budget from the state budget. The rest, 75%, they were asked to earn themselves. What it meant was that they opened businesses and banks, they opened security companies, and a lot of semi-legal businesses, through private enterprise, which they did. And they used some of that profit to set up pension funds for soldiers and housing, etc. But in general, the military budget in the democracy period has been very, very low. And most estimates say that it's somewhere between 0.6 and 0.8% of GDP. Now, given that 3% of GDP is the deficit limit set by various finance ministers, you can then see how low the 0.8%, or most people say 0.6% of the budget. So you have a very small military which hasn't fought major wars. There's not been any fragmentation in the military of the kind that you had in Egypt and elsewhere. So as a result, I don't see how this military can come back to power, especially when you see decentralized Indonesia. It would mean literally totally changing the constitution again and policing all of Indonesia by military force, and I don't see that as a possibility. Because the economy is doing well, the middle class is very strong and rising, and people are very politically conscious. So I don't think that that's something to worry about. There was one particular event that people, particularly Western newspapers, were very worried about, is when President Prabowo took his cabinet and took them to some kind of military boot camp where they all appeared in military uniform. And there were all kinds of comments saying, very soon all the cabinet members are going to be in boot pants as a living. But the thing about Indonesia, everybody likes to wear a uniform. I mean, even your neighborhood housing chairman would appear with the military uniform. All the governors are in uniform. They look like admirals. All the bupatis are in uniform. Your tax official is in uniform. So to read from that because there are some people, you have a meeting where everybody is dressed in uniform, that is the military coming back, I think is well, and not only an exaggeration, but it's totally ignorance of how Indonesia functions.
Well, it's quite remarkable because a country the size of Indonesia, 17,508 islands, and spread across thousands and thousands of kilometers, east to west and north to south, has a very nominal presence of its military. and even the Navy is and the Coast Guard are pretty small. So I think that it is remarkable also that most of the infrastructure development has been related to the civilian side. The connectivity is all based on inter-island ferries and air transport and things of that kind. How are other aspects which are important for the economy doing? In terms of GDP, I understand GDP growth has been healthy. Per capita income is rising. It's the macroeconomic stability of the country is pretty secure. It's quite amazing that they have very low budget deficits, etc. So overall, would you say that the economic side is being handled very professionally? Especially, I ask you that because there was a time when they had this massive problem at the end of the previous century and the start of this century, when you were heading the United Nations Support Facility for Economic Recovery of Indonesia.
Well, there are a number of things that one has to applaud the Indonesians for in the economic sector. And let me just go through 2 or 3 of the most important. I think the first thing that you have to understand is the scale of the economic shock they got in 1998. It wasn't just a recession. They went from a 7% trend growth rate over 35 years, suddenly a drop of 13.4% in 1 year. So a total of 21% drop in GDP in 1 year. And that is higher than what the USSR went through after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I think it's probably the highest in recorded recent economic history. It easily matches the Wall Street crash of 1929, etc. So once you have that, the general presumption is that it will take you 15, 20 years to get back on track. And you'll be very dependent, as Argentina has been and Chile has been and so on IMF loans and international conditionality and so on. The remarkable thing about Indonesia is that their recovery, compared to pre-crisis levels, took them barely 7 or 8 years to accomplish. The second thing which they did, which also is virtually unthinkable for any developing country, is to ask the IMF to politely leave and prepaid the debt they had to the IMF. And one of the reasons for that is that a photograph of Kang Desul, who was the head of the managing director of the IMF, standing with his hands crossed, towering over Suharto, who was then signing the IMF agreement. And this was considered to be a major insult to Indonesia. And virtually all the parties agreed that the first thing they should do is to get the IMF out. Now, so that's what happened. This was remarkable for one other reason, and not only because of national pride, which was that if you looked in the early years of how the external creditors, mostly the bilateral donors as well as the multilateral financial institutions, how they actually negotiated and worked with Indonesia. It was also a remarkable story because even in the poorest countries in sub-Saharan Africa, the so-called CGI meetings, which are a meeting between the external donors and the government, barely have 3 ministers. Usually the governor of the central bank, the finance minister, and maybe one other. In Indonesia, IMF conditionality covered everything from macroeconomics to water management and forestry. And I've never in my career, I've seen many of these CGI meetings all across the world. I've actually directed work on almost 44 countries. I've never seen this. In Indonesia, virtually 2/3 of the cabinet will be sitting there all day because there will be an agricultural conditionality, so the agriculture minister will be there. There will be conditionality on education, so there will be the education minister there, and so on. So it's deeply insulting. It was very counterproductive, and it seemed to have stiffened Indonesian resolve to get rid of this foreign assistance as fast as it could, and to a large extent, they managed it. So that itself was very remarkable. Finally, in terms of the structure of the economy, something remarkable happened. And that was that for the first time, they managed to create a vibrant, very fast growing domestic integrated market. Because remember, Indonesia, being the size of the United States in terms of geographical area, but scattered across different islands, didn't have any major cities. We're used to talking about Agra and Hyderabad and all kinds of much older cities with a big artisan population and secondary industry. They didn't have any of that. So there were virtually no major cities. Everything you see in Jakarta is barely 30, 35 years old. And in the last 10 years or so, they've managed to integrate this domestic market. There's a very fast-growing middle class, etc., etc. And there are no indications that this growth is likely to be torpedoed short of a major war and so on. And it used to be called a miracle country in the old days because it had high growth and low levels of inequality. Inequality levels have risen, but it's now a very high and stable growth with a young population, and all the projections are that it will continue to do very well.
So since we are on the economy, just another word about the changes in Indonesia. After all, is a commodity exporting country. So there have been some very major changes in recent years, mandating domestic processing of ores and how do you see that process having been rolled out?
That's a good question, and this is not a new policy concern. Most countries who have natural resources would like to capture as much of that value added as they could, rather than export raw materials. And what the Indonesians have been saying is that they want to have downstreaming, they want to build up their own processing and manufacturing capacity. It's particularly important for them because the base was so low. And one of the odd things, or the noticeable things in the economic structure in Indonesia, is that you have a very, very small number of trade-oriented firms at the top of the chain. Mostly second-generation Chinese-led businesses, but effectively not directed to the domestic market. Indonesia has virtually no middle industry working in almost any kind of area. They have some assembly plants, but it's a very weak. There's a big gap, and we always talk about the missing middle, and it really is missing. So you have the very small number of firms right at the top, and then you have everyone else at the bottom. In fact, it is so different because what they would call a small firm, maybe of 20 employees, mostly families, we would call a micro enterprise here. So in this situation, even to grow a domestic business community was not possible. Now it's possible because you have an integrated domestic market. It's possible because you have infrastructure, transport links and so on, which allows workers to move from one part of the country to another. And they did something else which was quite remarkable, and I've never seen this before, that by constitution amendment, within 2 years of the new democracy, they actually mandated that 20% of the government budget has to be spent on education. So imagine 20% of the government budget on education, compare that to the defense budget, compare that to anything else. And 2 years later, they'd actually initiated a social insurance program, which was to provide universal health care for every single citizen of Indonesia across this big archipelago. And what that tells me is that they had made a decision to which people like me were a part of that kind of advisory environment. We said, when you have systemic transitions, look after the distribution aspects first, not just the growth side. And it's a completely turnaround from what we had advised in Russia and advised in virtually the whole of the developing countries. So, and they took that initiative, and this was their decision, and it was totally against what all the external donors and so on were telling them. So it was quite a remarkable story, both on the economic side and in the political side. In the political side, one thing to remember is that they had virtually no help. They had a small unit of the USAID advisors sitting in their parliament, but all the major political decisions were domestically discussed, they were decided on, and they were enacted with tremendous speed. And where do you get that within an archipelago, which is so ethnically divided and so on and so on? So it is a remarkable story. They don't say it as loudly as I'm saying it, but they should, and I hope they will do that as time goes on.
Well, one more point before we turn to bilateral relations, and that relates to the Indian diaspora in Indonesia. It's an exceptionally well-integrated diaspora. It's small in size. It's very wealthy and prosperous. What is the latest from the diaspora? Because I remember that they were very valuable contributors to the Indonesian economy, and they were respected for what they were doing.
Yeah, I mean, this is so different from what you get from the Indian diaspora, let's say in East Africa, where they also have been extremely affluent and so on and so on, but universally disliked. And one of the reasons also was that the diaspora in East and Southern Africa was brought there under bonded labor conditions to build railways, etc., etc.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Indonesia, nothing like that happened. So it's basically a pretty prosperous and highly educated diaspora to begin with. Most Indonesians, when you talk about their impression of India, they'll immediately say that they are highly educated, they're very good managers, and they will start recounting all the international diaspora, which is running multinational companies, etc. So that sense that this is very special and these people are very educated. The other impression of Indonesians of Indians is that they are very highly cultured, that they maintain their cultural identity, they celebrate their festivals, and they don't cause trouble. You have very little crime, which is so all in all, it's a very favorable impression of what Indians are in a sense, and that's a big service, it seems to me. One other thing, as far as their contribution is concerned, is an interesting thing, is that you find that many business people and particularly managers in the Indian diaspora in Indonesia actually work for the large Chinese firms. So you have the Chinese management at the top, but usually the number 2, number 3 would be an Indian accountant, an Indian manager, etc. Because they're considered to be politically lightweight and can be dispensed with, but they're very highly paid, they're given a lot of responsibility, and in general, they're also very happy. So this is a very strange kind of situations where the Indians there are really work very closely with the Chinese businesses.
So some of them, however, are leading there. Some Indian conglomerates are actually present on the ground as industrialists, and
Yes.
so there is that element as well.
Yes, although the structure there has changed. Under Suharto, there used to be a famous Indian manufacturer called Srinivasan, and they were actually interested in manufacturing. Now it's a lot more in property development, in tourism, in restaurants, and so on and so on. And in one or two in textiles, like Mr. Lohia and others. But I think you'll see a lot more of that as this urban population and domestic market grows.
Okay, so let's come to the final segment now, which is our bilateral relationship. Because as you know, Satish, 75 years ago, India and Indonesia became independent. They together marked a new era of Asian resurgence. The promise of these early years, however, was followed by a long hiatus during the military rule in Indonesia. Since then, there's been a significant revival of relations over the last quarter century, but there's also disappointment that relations have remained well below their potential. Very recently, we had the visit of President Prabowo Subianto to India, marking the 75th anniversary of diplomatic relations. How do you assess the current state of this relationship, particularly in the most meaningful segment, which is the trade, investment, and economic relationship?
Well, let me say a couple of words about the past, because a lot of the disappointment is not only from the present, but also thinking about this long period where we should have been closer, particularly after Bandung, but we're not. And I think the biggest reason, the most important reason for that was the Cold War. And after Suharto particularly, because the Indonesian Communist Party was totally wiped out physically. And so the Cold War landed Suharto and the New Order government firmly in the American side. And in our case, we were leaning much more towards socialist management and economics, and much more allied with Russia. So automatically, since the Cold War was also played out in proxy all the way across the world, the same thing happened with us. So that is one big reason why we couldn't come together earlier. And then, of course, the whole issue of Pakistan, because Suharto had leaned towards co-opting many of the Islamic parties and Islamic grassroots activists into Golkar by adopting institutions of, let's say, Islamic intellectuals and so on. So that was not a period where they really wanted to back India against an Islamic country like Pakistan. So there were a lot of geopolitical reasons. It was not because the Indonesians suddenly thought that the Indians were not worth getting close to, but the space for doing that was much more limited. Coming to the relations at the moment, if you look at the numbers, in terms of trade, etc., they have increased dramatically, from about $2 billion to close to now $38, $39 billion. And because quite a lot is actually smuggled in, the actual numbers will be even higher than you see in the official. And also that is especially to services. So when you look at travel, tourism, consultancy, and all kinds of other things, again, it's underestimated, it seems to me. So the actual number, I would suspect, is probably about $44, $45 billion, which is such a big shift from what was there before. In terms of investment, there is a problem, and because our very large investors tend to go for the European and the American markets. The middle-sized ones, whether it is Godrej or whether it is Apollo or firms like that, which are very commonly known in India, are the people who are now looking at Indonesia as a way to, first step in becoming global is to actually access a market which is close to you, etc., etc. And they've tried several times. The problem on the Indonesian side is that, in the past, there's been a lot of emphasis, up to 10 years ago, by a number of Indian firms who simply went there and said, we want to buy coal mines. And there was short-term opportunism of that kind, particularly from people in Bihar and Jharkhand and others, only to find that the people who owned the mines on the other end were the old military generals. And that created a lot of bad publicity also. So I think there is some repair work to be done there. But the positive side is that Indonesia has always been an open capital market. You can repatriate your profits. The rules are now pretty clear. The company registration and so on is all online. The amount of corruption in that is lower. So I think, and then you have this domestic market, which is an attraction. So I think you will see in the next 5 to 10 years, if I'm not mistaken, at least a 50% increase in that investment by Indians in Indonesia, and hopefully by the Indonesians also, because they also have large, cash has not been a problem within the companies there. But again, they had some bad experience with Anthony Salim in Calcutta and
Yes.
others. So I think this needs to be explained and tackled rather than ignored, and then we just wait for them and look at the numbers.
So are we making some important strides in terms of connectivity, education, culture, tourism? Are these elements becoming more prominent in the economic side of the relationship?
Well, tourism, yes, because most of the Indian tourists come to Bali, and this is becoming an area where people go for honeymoons. The wealthier Indian diaspora actually has family meetings. They come from all over the world and spend quite a lot of money in Bali, and now whole of Eastern Indonesia, because from Bali is easy to travel out to neighboring islands, and they've got much better infrastructure, etc. So I think that is definitely happening. I think also in terms of trade in services, I think there's a lot more of it, because there are many Indian firms, even though they may have headquarters in Singapore or somewhere else, have offices in Indonesia. They travel very frequently, etc. So the numbers are not very reliable, but every time I talk to business friends, they're either coming to India, or they're welcoming Indian visitors, and that's true especially the fisheries industry, which is a new thing, because Indonesia has the largest fish output in the world at the moment. So there are many new firms coming through, and looking to the future, there are a number of areas where, of geopolitical necessity, the Indians and the Indonesians will have to work much closer together. For example, in terms of artificial intelligence, in terms of climate change, in terms of management of pandemics, which are the success of which depends on scale. And together, we're talking about 1.7 to 1.8 billion people, and so I'm very optimistic, and I think both the removal of old barriers as well as the geopolitics of today, push us in that direction, and that's one of the reasons we set up this Arthashastra Institute, to make sure that the misunderstandings and so on are cleared, and we create the proper kind of linkages which we need to do this.
Well, that's rather important, because I'd only like to add here that this recent visit of President Prabowo Subianto, it has led to very many new agreements between the two governments on trade, on economic relations, on defense and security ties, on people-to-people relations, and relations in the very areas which you mentioned, which is technology and so let's hope that that is going to be remedying to some extent this state which we have witnessed over the last 25 years of very good intentions but insufficient attention and follow through in the relationship. I think that's an important aspect.
Can I say just one word?
Yes.
I think knowing Indonesia and its recent history is critical to setting up expectations which are realistic and which we can track as measurable progress. And one of the things that we also don't understand is that the way the Indonesian civil service works, the way it is linked to ministerial appointments and so on, is very different from ours. So if we simply treat Indonesia as just another country with a similar civil service, because it's a democracy, similar form of government and so on, we tend to miss the wood for the trees, as it were. And that requires that, when we have these negotiations, we're able to actually see how that decision will work down their system. And what we tend to say, well, that's their business. But that's not a very intelligent approach. When we don't do that with Japan, we don't do that with the European Union and the Americans and so on. And we shouldn't be doing it in Indonesia, where the upheaval has been so dramatic. So I think that knowing more and understanding the difference between what is said and what is doable, and managing our expectations is the key to having greater confidence in the future.
That's an important point which you have mentioned, a very important insight. Finally, Indonesia and India are lands of faith. We have a Hindu majority population. Indonesia has a Islamic majority population, but both are widely known and recognized as tolerant societies, as plural societies, and this is inbuilt even constitutionally on both sides of the equation. So this last question really relates to India's civilizational links with Bali, and since you are based in Bali, what is the view from there about this ancient, perhaps nearly 2,000-year-old relationship between the communities, the Hindu communities in Bali and India?
Well, Bali has a population of about 4.2 million people. There are lots of foreigners who come and go as tourists and as visitors from other parts of Indonesia. But there is, a collection of Indians who actually live in Bali. One of the things you notice in Bali, the moment you walk in, that it smells of Hinduism. You get into the airport, the statues you see, the garlands that you see, the jasmine that you can smell, all of that makes you feel that you're in familiar territory if you're a Hindu going from India. You walk out of there, you will see large numbers of people carrying pots on their head with the fruit, etc. And that's not only the poorest people, even the richest families, have their women and men in religious dress walking to the temples. Every month, Purnama, which we look at and photograph because you have a full moon, they actually go and worship and go to the river or to the sea and perform religious rites. So it's a very living kind of Hinduism. It's not something that we like to do in particular pujas. It's day to day. Every single Balinese home has an area of worship, and they offer flowers and so on every single day. So that way, it's a very living kind of religion, I think, and they totally identify with India. And virtually all Balinese that I know will be able to recite the Mahamrityunjaya mantra. And you can see how many of us here would be able to do the same, or the Gayatri mantra and so on. Now, they've also developed that because they have prayers. If you go 6 o'clock in the morning, you turn the radio on, and you will actually see a prayer, which is Gayatri mantra version, but they sing it in a way that it will be difficult for you to understand. And then at 12 o'clock, exactly in the same way, it repeats, and then in the evening. So that's a call to prayers. Now it could be because of resistance to Islam, showing that they have their own prayers and timings and so on. But whatever it is, it's meant to preserve their own cultures and so on. So I think that is very strong. But it's not only Bali. If you go to almost anywhere in Indonesia, whether it is Jakarta, or whether it's Surabaya, or whether it's in Bandung, or whether it's smaller towns like Malang and so many others, there is nowhere where you will not see statues of Ganesh. You will not see statues of Garuda and Vishnu Garuda and so on and so on. And they're not defaced. You don't have graffiti sprayed on them, etc., etc. So it's not only Bali. You go to Jakarta and you will see right in front of the presidential palace a very large and fancy statue of the Arjun Krishna Samvad, and nobody is there trying to topple it and sit on it and drink beer on it or whatever people who want to offend the other religion tend to do. So there is that recognition that they have some common origins. If you go to Java, if you go to Yogyakarta and so on, and see the old script that they used to use until Sukarno actually, declared a one language policy and so on. It looks so much like something you could read. It's that familiar, And in many cases, if they had, let's say, they would say Krishna dress, then they write it in English in such a way that they write it under the line, so it looks like Hindu, So there is and then in the names, one of my good friends, Angitu Abmanyu, is the Deputy Minister of Finance. He was in the Ministry of Religion before. He's been to Hajj at least 10 times, and he's called Angitu Abmanyu. The ex-president is called Yudhoyono, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. And Yudhoyono, there are banks called Arthagraha. When you want to introduce your wife to somebody, you will say Istri, and the wife will introduce you as Swami. Things that we are totally forgotten about, but it's common language there. So you see it in the language, you see it in the food, you see it in the history, you see it in the Bollywood films they watch, and you see it when people all through the night are waking up watching episodes of Mahadeva. It's a very living kind of influence. It's not something that they look in picture books and so on. So, there is tremendous similarity between us. There are differences, but if you're dealing with each other for 2,000 years, there must be differences. We must learn got quite a lot from them. So I think it's a very exciting area, and it's something we need to build on.
Thank you, Satish. I'd like to say that two of our countries, looking back at my own time in Indonesia, I would doubt if there are any other two countries in Asia which share such civilizational similarities and affinities as do India and Indonesia. You realize that when you see their national emblem, which is the Garuda. You realize that when their national motto is unity in diversity. And I think that this is a relationship which must grow, which must be a more vibrant relationship, bringing our two countries together, and once more leading to Asia's resurgence. Thank you so much for your insights on Indonesia, Satish. All the very best with your Arthashastra Institute, and we will see you again on your next trip to India. Thank you.
Thank you.